You don't wake up one morning and become chosen because a spotlight turns on over your head. The false belief is that being chosen means being singled out for comfort, clarity, and an easy sense of belonging. It's the fantasy that if God is revealing the truth, then the truth will arrive like a clean announcement and your life will finally stop feeling like a messy argument with itself. But the first thing that makes sense, if you're honest, is the opposite. The so-called revelation rarely reduces complexity. It intensifies it. It strips away the stories you used to tolerate and leaves you face to face with what you've been avoiding. If there's any mark that separates people who keep moving from people who keep chasing signs, it isn't special access. It's the willingness to be disappointed by simple explanations. Chosen becomes a word people use to protect themselves from randomness, from rejection, from the ache of being ordinary in a loud world. And yet the moment you stop treating it as a medal and start treating it as a task, the whole idea changes shape. It stops being a claim about status and becomes a claim about attention. You're being asked to look carefully, to listen closely, to live as if your actions carry weight, even when nobody applauds. That's why everything makes sense now is both seductive and dangerous. It can be a door into humility, or it can be a trapdoor into ego. From the outside, the chosen story looks like certainty. People see someone who cuts off a friend group, quits a job, stops drinking, stops chasing, stops explaining, and they assume it's arrogance or superiority. They call it holier than thou, delusional, extreme. They see the calm face and think it means you have answers they don't. But the reality is usually less glamorous. The calm is often a thin layer over a relentless internal reckoning. The person isn't floating above life. They're being pressed into it. They're noticing how often they say yes when they mean both, how often they use humor to hide fear, how often they demand proof of love while refusing to be known. The appearance is certainty. The reality is a new intolerance for self-deception. In that gap, misunderstandings grow. People who rely on you to keep the old version of yourself alive feel betrayed by your change, and they'll interpret your boundaries as judgment. Meanwhile, you might interpret their discomfort as persecution, and that's where the story gets distorted. Not everyone who doubts you is an enemy. Not every closed door is an attack. Sometimes the world is just reacting to your new shape the way a room reacts when you move furniture. It feels awkward before it feels right. The truth can be revealed without turning you into a prophet. It can simply make you less willing to lie. The mechanism underneath all this is as human as it is spiritual, meaning-making. The brain is built to connect dots, especially under stress. When your life feels chaotic, your mind searches for patterns, like a hand searching for a railing in the dark. Faith can become that railing, but so can paranoia. And the two can mimic each other if you're not careful. A coincidence happens, then another, and suddenly you feel surrounded by messages. The danger isn't that God can't speak through patterns. It's that you can start worshipping the pattern itself. Confirmation bias turns normal events into evidence, and your nervous system, hungry for safety, interprets sense as control. That's why some people become addicted to signs and prophecies, not because they love God, but because they're terrified of uncertainty. Real revelation doesn't remove uncertainty. It teaches you to tolerate it without running. It doesn't inflate you. It exposes you. It doesn't say, you're different, so you're exempt. It says, you're different, so you're accountable. And accountability is not a warm feeling. It's waking up and realizing your old coping strategies worked, but they cost you your integrity. It's realizing you can't keep blaming people for wounds you refuse to heal. If everything suddenly makes sense, ask what part of you is relieved and what part of you is still afraid. There's a hidden dynamic people rarely admit out loud. The chosen narrative is often born at the intersection of pain and longing. Some people start using it after betrayal, after a family fracture, after a collapse that left them ashamed. The thought, I'm chosen, becomes a counterweight to I'm unwanted. It's a way to survive the bruising experience of being dismissed. In that sense, it can be merciful. It can keep someone from drowning. But if the story hardens, it becomes a shell. You stop risking intimacy, because you've labeled ordinary relationships as low vibration or not aligned. You stop hearing feedback because you've decided all criticism is spiritual warfare. You stop learning because you've confused being guided with being right. The inner dynamic is subtle. You're protecting your tender places with theology, sometimes without knowing it. And then you start demanding that life prove your chosenness. Blessings, success, public validation, a neat narrative arc. When those things don't arrive, you panic or you invent enemies. That's not revelation, that's a nervous system begging to be soothed. True spiritual maturity looks less like a person who can predict the future and more like a person who can sit with the present without collapsing into fantasy. The truth, when it's real, doesn't need you to exaggerate it. It holds up under ordinary daylight. A concrete scene makes this clearer. Picture a crowded bus late in the afternoon, the kind where people avoid eye contact because everyone is tired and slightly guarded. You're standing with one hand on the rail, scrolling past messages you haven't answered, feeling that familiar tug. The world wants you to perform, to respond, to be useful, to be agreeable. At the next stop, an older man gets on, moving slowly. Nobody rushes to help, not out of cruelty, but out of that modern numbness where everyone is trying not to be seen. You notice him, and you feel something small and sharp inside. Not dramatic, just clear. You step aside, offer your seat, and he nods without fanfare. The revelation isn't thunder. It's a quiet alignment between what you believe and what you do. Later, you get home and find out a friend is angry you didn't reply earlier. The old you would have rushed to explain. The new you chooses honesty. I wasn't available. That's not spiritual performance. It's integrity. If you're chosen for anything, it might be for that kind of steadiness, the kind that costs you approval. Nobody on the bus claps. Your friend might still be upset, yet something inside you feels cleaner, less divided. That is what sense can feel like. Not a triumph, but a reduction in inner noise. Now consider the counterexample because it matters. There's a person who declares themselves chosen loudly, publicly, with constant announcements about divine favor. They post cryptic warnings. They interpret every disagreement as proof they're on the right path. Their life becomes a stage where they are always the main character and everyone else is either a supporter or an obstacle. They burn friendships with the certainty that God is separating me. They treat struggle as a sign of greatness and basic consequences as persecution. In the beginning, it looks powerful, even inspiring to people who are desperate for certainty. But watch what happens over time. Their circle shrinks, not because they're too holy, but because they're too exhausting. They demand loyalty, but offer little accountability. They promise transformation, but avoid ordinary responsibilities, paying bills, apologizing, listening, working consistently. When the promised breakthrough doesn't come, they double down, escalating language to protect the image. This is not rare. It's a recognizable pattern. The chosen identity becomes an excuse to avoid the humble work of becoming trustworthy. The tragedy is that the person may genuinely believe God is revealing truth to them, but they're using that belief to bypass the very refinement that revelation requires. Their outward confidence is often a mask for an unhealed wound. They're trying to prove they matter by declaring it. Their counterexample isn't there to mock, it's there to warn. A story that can't survive ordinary reality isn't a truth. It's a coping strategy. Nuance is where the discussion stops being a caricature. Not every strong conviction is ego, and not every quiet person is humble. Some people are actually called to unpopular choices. Some shifts are real separations, leaving an environment that celebrates numbness, stepping away from a cycle that keeps you small, walking out of a relationship that feeds your worst instincts. Discernment is the difference between conviction and vanity, between guidance and impulsivity. One way to test it is to examine what your belief produces in you over time. Does it make you more patient with people who are struggling or more contemptuous? Does it increase your honesty or your need to perform? Does it make you more willing to learn or more allergic to correction. Another test is secrecy. Can you practice what you claim without needing an audience? Real spiritual clarity often makes you less dramatic, not more. It makes you less interested in being misunderstood and more interested in being faithful. But nuance also includes the fact that the people will misread you anyway. Sometimes you'll be accused of arrogance when you're simply refusing to be manipulated. Sometimes you'll be praised for strength when you're actually dissociating. The truth can be revealed and still be misunderstood, even by you. That's why the journey isn't a straight line from confusion to certainty. It's a process of learning what voice you're actually listening to. If everything is starting to make sense, what may be happening is that you're noticing the cost of your old life with a new clarity. You can see how distractions were functioning as anesthesia. You can see how certain relationships depended on your lack of boundaries. You can see how you used spirituality as a costume or used cynicism as armor. The inner dynamic here is not mystical. It's psychological and moral at the same time. You're integrating. Your values are beginning to match your behavior, and when that happens, the world feels less chaotic because you're no longer living in contradiction. That can look like God revealing the truth because it feels like light entering a room you've kept dim for years. But integration also triggers grief. You mourn the time you lost, the compromises you made, the parts of yourself you abandoned for acceptance. You might feel anger at people who benefited from your confusion. That anger can be a stage, not a destination. The revelation is not just about seeing others clearly. It's about seeing yourself without excuses. If you keep going, you'll notice how easy it is to substitute spiritual language for actual change. It's easier to say, "I'm being refined," than to admit, "I'm afraid of being ordinary." It's easier to say, "God is removing them," than to admit, "I never learned how to choose well." When truth lands, it doesn't just explain your life. It exposes your patterns. Another everyday scene. A kitchen late at night, the kind of quiet where the refrigerator hum is louder than your thoughts. You're holding your phone, rereading a message that stings. Someone you cared about has minimized you again, and your fingers hover over the keyboard, ready to defend yourself with a long paragraph. You can feel the old pull: prove your worth, plead for understanding, negotiate your dignity. Then something shifts. Not a voice booming from the ceiling, just a clean awareness. You don't have to audition for respect. You set the phone down. You wash a glass slowly, feeling the urge to react rise and fall like a wave. The next day you respond with a single sentence that isn't cold, isn't cruel, just firm. And for a moment, the old world loses its grip. That is how truth often shows up. It changes your timing. It interrupts your reflex. It makes you act like a person who believes what they claim. The outside world may interpret your restraint as arrogance or indifference. They may even bait you harder. But inside, something is settling into place. It's not that you've become untouchable. It's that you've stopped confusing intensity with intimacy. If God is revealing anything, it might be this: not everything deserves your energy. Some battles are just invitations to become your old self again. At this point, the central thesis becomes unavoidable. Being chosen is not a title to claim, but a responsibility to carry, especially when nobody is watching and nothing is guaranteed. The truth, when it's real, doesn't inflate your sense of importance. It increases your capacity to endure reality without distortion. It asks you to hold two things at once: that your life matters and that you are not the center of the universe. That tension is the training. It prevents you from collapsing into nihilism, and it prevents you from drifting into grandiosity. People want a version of chosenness that feels like immunity. Immunity from rejection, failure, boredom, delay. But the more honest version is almost inconvenient. It means you may do the right thing and still lose something. You may obey what you believe is right and still be misunderstood. You may become more disciplined and still feel lonely. You may grow and still ache. The reveal is that meaning doesn't cancel pain. It gives pain a place to go, And you don't get to outsource the work to a label. You have to show up in your life with the kind of character that can hold revelation without turning it into theater. In that sense, the truth isn't a secret reserved for special people. It's a demand placed on anyone who dares to live awake. So, if everything makes sense now, take a hard look at what kind of sense it is. Is it the sense that makes you gentler, steadier, harder to bribe with attention? Or is it the sense that turns everyone else into background characters and makes you allergic to humility? The paradox is the genuine revelation often makes you feel less chosen in the way you imagined and more chosen in the way you feared. It doesn't say you're above the struggle, it says you're responsible inside the struggle. It may even strip away your excitement and leave you with ordinary faithfulness, returning calls you promised, doing your work with care, telling the truth when it costs you, refusing shortcuts that would rot you from the inside. That's not cinematic, but it's rare. And the quiet final strike is this: the moment you stop needing to be seen as chosen, your life starts to look like it.